Hello, and welcome to our webinar Using Medical Interpreters Effectively, an Interprecast training series webinar. Thank you for being with us today. At Interprenet, we are focused on two things: providing quality interpreters and making sure our clients are delighted with the services we provide. Interprecast, our training division, was created to support the ever-growing demand for qualified interpreters. Interprecast is dedicated to developing training programs for individuals pursuing a career in interpretation or individuals with a desire to learn how to interpret within their current position. We know that a trained interpreter will make all the difference. However, that is not enough if a client doesn't know how to use the interpreter effectively. This webinar was created to address this issue. How many times after a patient interview with an interpreter present have you felt that something got lost in translation? Or a few weeks later, when the patient is back, feeling worse, upset that the doctor's prescription didn't work, you discover that the patient didn't follow the instructions you gave. This webinar will help healthcare professionals understand what an interpreter does, how to use an interpreter effectively, and why a trained interpreter makes all the difference. You will learn what you can do to provide meaningful language access and ensure patient satisfaction. During this webinar, we will define the interpreter's function, look at the demographics and regulations that sustain the need for interpreters. We'll also show you the types of interpreters there are and the roles the interpreter assumes during provider-patient encounters. We will also talk about the importance of language access plans, touch on best practices when using an interpreter, address common errors and risks, and finally, the benefits of training bilingual staff and using trained resources. This information will help ensure effective communication between you and your patients, resulting in higher positive outcomes. The goal of the interpreter is to render a message from one language into another, accurately and completely. Remember those two words, accurately and completely. The interpreter's function is to bridge the gap in communication between two people, so from that point of view, the interpreter is as good as the other two people in the room. What does this mean? It means that to achieve effective communication, the parties need to follow certain rules. Otherwise, it is likely that communication will break down or fail at some point. Before we go into interpreter types and roles, let's look at the demographics and the legal framework that sustain the need for interpreters. So why do we need interpreters? As immigration grows, demand grows, and with that growth, potential problems arise. Communicating effectively with your patients shouldn't be one. In 2013, approximately 61.6 million individuals, foreign and US born, spoke a language other than English at home. While the majority also spoke English with native fluency or very well, about 25% were considered limited English proficient or LEP. Remember that acronym because we'll be using it a lot. LEP. 8% of the total US population age 5 and older is considered LEP. Now, let's look at the highest concentration rates by state. As of 2013, the highest concentrations of LEP individuals were found in the 6 traditional immigrant destination states: California, Texas, New York, Florida, Illinois, and New Jersey. Together, the top 6 states accounted for approximately 2/3 of the LEP population, with California holding 1/3. 94% of LEP individuals reside in metropolitan areas. So if you are a doctor working in a metropolitan area, it is very likely you have had an interview with an interpreter present and will continue to use interpreters. What is the regulation environment? To support and protect the LEP population, the government developed a legal framework of language access laws. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination based on national origin, which means recipients of federal funds have the obligation to provide meaningful access to LEP individuals. Failure to provide these services when necessary is considered discriminatory and illegal. Continuing along this framework, we have Executive Order 13166, stating that LEP people have the right to meaningful access to federally funded programs and activities. The executive order requires federal agencies to examine the services they provide, identify any need for services to those with limited English proficiency, and develop and implement a system to provide those services to LEP populations. This is the basis for meaningful access, which equals effective communication. Before we go into the main point of the webinar, let us review once again the interpreter's goal. The interpreter's goal is to render a message from one language to another language accurately and completely. For example, "Hello, how are you?" is "Hello, how are you?" It should not be "Hey, what's up?" Although the message is complete and equivalent, the register or degree of formality is inaccurate and could lead to misunderstanding. When you look at the industry, there are two types of interpreters, trained and untrained. Untrained interpreters are also referred to as ad hoc interpreters. A trained interpreter has received at least 40 hours of formal training that includes medical terminology, code of ethics, standards of practice, interpreting protocols, and regulations. 40 hours is the minimum interpreter training required by hospitals and clinics, and although it is not enough, at least the medical facility is assured the interpreter understands expectations. An untrained interpreter is a person with no formal training who is called upon to interpret, such as a family member, a bilingual staff member, a volunteer, or an advanced language student. Accuracy and completeness are at risk when using an untrained interpreter, not to mention potential ethical and protocol breaches. A trained interpreter is always better equipped to tackle the linguistic, ethical, and protocolary challenges an interview with an LEP person can present. Let's look at medical interpreter roles. The interpreter's function is mainly to serve as a bridge of communication between two parties. However, a trained interpreter will assume different roles during an encounter. We will take a look at those roles and how they affect the provider-patient encounter. This will help you understand the different tasks an interpreter must perform during an encounter in order to guarantee effective communication. There are 4 roles the interpreter will assume during the provider-patient encounter. As you can see in the pyramid, the least assumed role is advocate. The next is cultural broker, followed by clarifier. Finally, the most assumed role where the interpreter performs most of the time is conduit. In each role, the interpreter moves from the main role of conduit to the other 3 roles. We will explain what each role comprises. Conduit. This is the default role of the interpreter where his or her responsibility is to render all utterances accurately and completely. This means the interpreter cannot add, omit, or paraphrase. This is the role that the interpreter will assume most of the time, the base of the pyramid. Clarifier. Interpreters act as clarifiers when the utterances are unclear or create confusion. If the terms have no linguistic equivalency, it is the interpreter's job to ask for an explanation and proceed to interpret it. If the provider uses language too complex for the patient to understand, the interpreter should address the issue and let the provider know that he or she will adjust to a lower register. Essentially, in the clarifier role, the interpreter aims to facilitate that understanding and will proceed to ask questions, adjust register, explain terms with no linguistic equivalency, etc., so the parties communicate clearly with each other. This is the second most assumed role. Cultural broker. Many misunderstandings occur due to cultural barriers. The interpreter should be familiar with the culture of the patient to detect any cultural misunderstandings and provide the cultural framework for the parties to gain that understanding. If at all possible, use an interpreter that is considered a native speaker of the language. Interpreters with native or near native proficiency are usually better acquainted with cultural practices and traditions. As an example, here are 3 situations that can produce a negative outcome due to lack of cultural competency. A woman won't take off a red ribbon tied around her belly for a prenatal ultrasound. A patient refuses to take cold liquids after surgery. A man with gallbladder disease refuses to comply with the nutritionist's dietary recommendations. These are situations you might dismiss if you don't have someone that can intervene to help you cross the cultural barrier. Cultural competency is fundamental to ensure positive outcomes in patient treatment. Advocate. In this role, the interpreter stops being the interpreter and becomes the patient's voice. In this role, the interpreter acts on certain issues that he or she feels are necessary for the patient to get the care needed. The interpreter is concerned about the quality of care that the LEP patient is about to receive. It is the most active role an interpreter can assume, and usually the least frequent one. It is very rare. There's a lot of controversy over how much an interpreter should become involved in the patient's healthcare needs. The consensus is that this role should be assumed by the interpreter only if the patient's or a third party's health or life is at risk. Now that you're familiar with the roles the interpreter can assume, we will present the best practices for effective communication, including tips for enhancing the flow of communication. Following these guidelines before, during, and after the session will allow the parties to communicate and understand each other better. First, familiarize yourself with your organization's language access plan. By law, every organization that receives federal funding must have a language access plan. This document contains the guidelines, options, and best practices for procuring language resources and providing meaningful language access. The most important thing you need to know for an effective language access plan is your demographic. Your demographic gives you a better understanding of the LEP population you will be working with. Before using an interpreter, the scheduler will identify the potential LEP customer and make sure there is an interpreter available at the time of the appointment. The scheduler should allow extra time for the interview, since it will at least take twice the time. If you have to work with an untrained interpreter or a family member, meeting them prior to the interview is a good idea so that you can provide some ground rules or set goals. This is not necessary when you have a trained interpreter. Trained interpreters start a session with a brief introduction that includes setting ground rules for both parties. Some healthcare professionals may be annoyed by this practice because either they think it takes time away from the interview or they've heard it a million times. Don't be annoyed. The use of an interpreter may be new to the LEP patient and the rules apply to both parties. This brief introduction will save you time in the long run and keep you on schedule. Now, before we continue, it is very important for you to know something, just like you would do with an English speaker. Do not say anything you don't want the patient to hear. Interpreters will interpret everything. It's their job. A lot of patients and doctors have regretted speaking their minds with an interpreter in front of them. Once the session has started, here are a few techniques that you can apply to make communication flow better. Seat the interpreter beside or slightly behind the patient to promote eye contact between you and the patient. Speak directly to the patient. This will allow the interpreter to serve as a bridge of communication. Look at the patient, not at the interpreter. It is easy to forget this and turn to the interpreter because she is the person responding to your utterance. A trained interpreter will prompt you either by lowering her gaze or using a hand gesture to get the parties back on track. Speaking in the first person will ensure that, although there is a third person in the room, the conversation is between two people. Speak as if the interpreter wasn't there. As the session continues, focus on how you speak to the patient. Here are a few best practices to ensure effective communication. Speak in short sentences. Avoid providing large chunks of information. Interpreters, no matter how qualified, are not sponges. Only one speaker at a time, and only one question at a time. This ensures the messages are clear. Do not interrupt the interpreter unless it's absolutely necessary. If you have a question, let the interpreter finish. Limit your key points to 3 or less. This will ensure that both the interpreter retains the information and the patient absorbs it. Focusing on 3 or fewer points will ensure the patient grasps the key messages. During the session, also think about the language you're using. Slang, idioms, and humor are difficult to translate and often get lost in translation. Sometimes slang and humor are good for breaking the ice and help build rapport with the patient, but when dealing with an LEP patient, these types of expressions can cause problems. When using them, the interpreter will immediately try to find an equivalent expression. If there's no equivalent, the interpreter will have to explain it to the patient. And what happens when someone doesn't get the joke? It may lead to tangential conversations in an effort to explain the meaning. Same concern with acronyms. Although some acronyms seem to be very well known, such as MRI, IV, the interpreter will spell them out if he or she knows the meaning. Acronyms for less known procedures should be explained to avoid mistranslation or misunderstanding, which can lead to tangential conversations as well. Tangential conversations need to be reduced because they usually lead to confusion and can make you lose control of the interview. Once the session has ended, ask the patient to repeat your instructions. This is a good practice in general. Discuss with the interpreter if he or she needs to clarify or correct something. It is a fair question. Trained interpreters will jump at the opportunity to correct if necessary. Implementing and making a habit of these practices will ensure effective communication, resulting in less return visits and increased patient satisfaction. Before we continue, we would like to discuss an important issue. A common misconception is thinking that anybody who speaks another language is qualified to interpret. Maybe you have heard some of the following statements. My staff is bilingual, they can interpret. My daughter or my friend is bilingual, she can translate for me. I have a bachelor's degree in Spanish, it is expected of me to be able to interpret. I have interpreted for my relative at a restaurant before. I can do it again for her doctor's appointment. It is possible that a bilingual individual may do it. However, with no training, errors are bound to happen. Although being bilingual is necessary, it is not enough. So before taking that risk, you should ask, do you have any formal training? Please note that this is not a value judgment nor a criticism. There are untrained interpreters with years of experience that are very good, and there may be trained interpreters with less experience that might not be as good. Having said that, dissecting a frog in high school does not make me a doctor. So, for anyone who claims to be able to interpret, the question is, do you have any formal training? It is very possible that they won't, but at least now you know the risks and what you should be looking out for. During an encounter, you can come across different types of untrained resources. Even though with a professional background, a volunteer or ad hoc interpreter may lack knowledge of medical terminology, standards of practice, and protocols, and additionally they may be unprepared to face ethical challenges. For example, what to do if the patient asks for the interpreter's opinion or discloses sensitive information and asks the interpreter to not tell the doctor. A trained interpreter will know exactly what to do when faced with these conundrums. Using family and friends to interpret is a common pitfall. Unfortunately, sometimes there's no other choice. You should be careful with family and friends because they may have personal agendas or may provide unsolicited advice. If untrained, family and friends have no understanding of HIPAA laws, so there's no guarantee of confidentiality. There is a risk of losing control of the interview due to unsolicited advice or side conversations. A family member or friend will very likely assume the role of advocate and will hinder the communication between patient and provider. And last but not least, children should not be used to interpret. They are unfamiliar with adult issues and the language of medicine. The situation itself may cause them embarrassment, and it puts a tremendous burden on the child. It is unprofessional and unethical. Why is it risky to use someone without the proper training? A recent study showed that interpreter errors can play a significant role in medical mistakes. Over the course of 7 months, researchers monitored 13 encounters between physicians, non-English speaking patients, and their interpreters. In 6 of the cases, interpreters were professionally trained. The rest were on-hand, untrained interpreters, including nurses, family members, or social workers. The results shown on the slide refer to those made by untrained interpreters. In 52% of the recorded errors, the interpreter omitted a portion of the utterance. In 16%, the interpreter made up words or phrases. 13%, the interpreter used a word with a different meaning. 10%, the interpreter inserted his or her unwanted opinion, and 8%, the interpreter added words not present in the original utterance. The consequences of these errors were significant. 18% of the errors had potential clinical consequences, while the mean number of errors of clinical consequence per encounter was 6. That translates into a lot of risk. In some organizations, it may be required to rely on bilingual staff for some interpreting. If that is the case, we strongly recommend implementing a proper training program to guarantee effective communication. The outline for training bilingual staff is test, train, and deploy. Test for fluency, train for interpreting skills, and implement a plan for the staff to check in and check out of each role as required. Having trained resources at hand can serve 2 purposes: compliance and meaningful language access. To recap, let's review the do's and don'ts of our best practices. Don't use untrained resources if possible. This will generate a bunch of don'ts. Untrained resources can result in a potential liability. Don't say anything you don't want the patient to hear. Treat the LEP patient like you would any other patient. Don't be afraid to ask the interpreter if there's anything that needs correction. Do let the interpreter make a brief introduction. An introduction sets clear rules for both parties. Do speak in the first person, directly to the patient, and make eye contact with the patient. The interpreter is supposed to be invisible. Do insist on everything being interpreted, especially side conversations. Do limit the encounter to 3 points or fewer. This will ensure the patient grasps all the important information. Do familiarize yourself with your hospital or clinic's language access plan. These practices make meaningful language access possible and easier to achieve. As a final note, having well-trained interpreters has several benefits. Although communication is in and of itself an error-prone activity, Using trained interpreters will lower the incidence of errors and misunderstandings. Good healthcare happens when communities and providers work together. It reflects commitment to the community and inclusivity. A well-implemented language access plan that includes trained bilingual staff, trained on-site interpreters, and trained external resources results in effective communication, which in turn results in lower return visit rates and increased patient satisfaction. I'm sure you're already aware of this. Medical errors can cost millions of dollars. Rather than wasting time meeting with lawyers, invest time in making sure there's a solid language access plan in your hospital. All of this will lower malpractice risk. And finally, it's the law. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. Please contact us for more information about our services. Thank you.